Patricia Warren stood in the driveway watching her son load the last of her belongings into a donation truck, and that's when she understood with perfect clarity that after 45 years of marriage, she had been erased from her own life. The house she'd raised 3 children and now belonged to someone else. The bank accounts she believed were joint had been emptied before she even knew to look. And the man she trusted with everything had replaced her with a woman barely older than their youngest daughter, without so much as a conversation about what came next. At 73, Patricia had become invisible. But what her ex-husband Raymond and his new wife didn't know, what no one in the family had bothered to ask about during the hurried division of assets, was that Patricia's father had left her something decades ago. Something so quiet and unremarkable that she had almost forgotten it herself. A deed to a mountain cabin, tucked in an envelope she hadn't opened since the funeral in 1987, sitting in a safety deposit box no one else knew existed. And the moment she remembered it, everything changed. 3 months earlier, Patricia had been standing in a different place entirely. The kitchen of the home on Maple Street where she had cooked approximately 49,275 meals. Give or take a few thousand. Raymond sat at the table reading something on his phone, not looking up when she placed his coffee beside him, not saying good morning, not saying much of anything lately. She had noticed the distance growing for years, the way conversations shortened, the way his attention drifted, the way he started taking calls in the garage instead of the living room. But she had told herself it was normal, that marriages settled into comfortable silence after so many years, that expecting constant engagement was unrealistic at their age. Then one Tuesday in March, Raymond cleared his throat and said, "We need to talk about some changes." The way he said it, so calm, so measured, made her stomach drop before he even finished the sentence. Because men don't use that tone to discuss remodeling the bathroom or switching insurance providers. They use it when they've already made a decision and are simply informing you of the outcome. "I've been unhappy for a long time," he said, still not quite meeting her eyes. "And I think it's time we both moved on." Patricia set down the dish towel she'd been holding. "Moved on to what?" "Separate lives." He slid a folder across the table. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. Everything's outlined here. It's fair." She opened the folder slowly, scanning pages that seemed to have been designed by someone who had never met her, never known her, never cared that she existed. The house would be sold. Proceeds divided. Retirement accounts Raymond's. Her name removed from everything except a small monthly allowance that felt more like dismissal than support. "This is fair," she asked quietly. "You haven't worked in 40 years, Patricia. I provided everything. I raised your children. Our children are grown." She looked at him then, really looked, searching for the man she had married in 1978, the one who had promised partnership, who had held her hand through difficult births and frightening diagnoses, who had once told her she was the only person he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. But that man wasn't there anymore. Maybe he hadn't been for a long time. "There's someone else, isn't there?" Patricia asked. Raymond didn't deny it, didn't apologize, just nodded once, as if confirming a weather forecast. The divorce moved quickly after that. Raymond had planned well, transferring assets months before filing, restructuring accounts, consulting lawyers while Patricia still believed they were simply going through a rough patch. By the time she understood what was happening, most of it was already done. Their children, grown and busy with their own complicated lives, didn't take sides so much as avoid the situation entirely. A few uncomfortable phone calls. Vague promises to visit once things settled down. Then silence. Within 8 weeks, the house sold. Raymond moved into a renovated downtown condo with Melissa, the 48-year-old pharmaceutical rep he'd met at a conference. And Patricia found herself standing in a storage unit surrounded by boxes containing the physical remains of a life that no longer had a place to exist. Her son David showed up that afternoon to help sort things. He didn't ask where she was going to live, didn't offer his guest room, just kept checking his phone between trips to the donation truck, clearly eager to finish and get back to his own responsibilities. "You'll be okay, Mom," he said, in the tone people use when they need to believe something more than you do. "You're tougher than you think." Then he drove away, and Patricia stood alone in the parking lot with 2 suitcases, $847 in her checking account, and absolutely no idea what came next. That night, sitting in a budget motel that smelled like cleaning chemicals and defeat, she started going through the papers she'd managed to keep. Birth certificates, old tax returns, her parents' death certificates, and tucked in the back of the folder, an envelope she hadn't thought about in decades. Her father's handwriting across the front, "For Patricia, when you need it." The safety deposit box key had been in Patricia's jewelry box for 37 years, attached to a small tag with her father's handwriting that simply read, First National, Box 127. She had visited the bank the morning after finding the envelope, her hands shaking slightly as she signed the access log, unsure what she would find but certain it mattered. Inside the narrow metal drawer was a single folder containing a property deed, a hand-drawn map, and a letter written on paper that had yellowed with time. Patricia unfolded the letter carefully. Her father's familiar script, slightly shaky from the illness that would take him 6 months after he wrote it, filled the page. "Dear Patricia, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you need help. I bought this land in 1971 when it was worthless, just Rocky Mountain property nobody wanted. Built a small cabin there with my own hands over 5 summers. Your mother thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. But I always believed in having something nobody could take from you, something that existed outside of everything else. The deed is in your name only. It always has been. The cabin isn't much, but it's shelter. And shelter, sweetheart, is where everything else begins. Love, Dad." Patricia's vision blurred as she read the last line twice. Then she examined the deed. 40 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains, deeded to Patricia and Warren, recorded in 1985, fully paid. Property taxes current, through an automatic payment her father had apparently set up before he died, and somehow maintained through his estate. The map showed rough terrain, a winding access road, and a small square marked cabin near a creek. She had never seen it, had never asked about it. Her father had mentioned a mountain project once or twice, but she'd been busy with young children, distracted by the daily demands of her life, and the conversations had drifted away unfinished. Now, sitting in a bank lobby with fluorescent lights humming overhead, Patricia understood that her father had given her exactly what he promised, something nobody could take. The drive took 4 hours. The paved road ended after 3, replaced by gravel that eventually became dirt, winding up through dense forest that seemed to close in around her car. Patricia followed the map carefully, second-guessing every turn, until she finally spotted the wooden post her father had marked on the drawing. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by pine trees and mountain laurel. It was smaller than she'd imagined, rough timber construction with a stone chimney and a covered porch that sagged slightly on one side. The roof needed work. The windows were dark, but it stood, solid and real. Patricia parked and sat for a long moment, just looking. Then she got out, walked up the creaking steps, and tried the door. Locked. She searched the porch and found the key exactly where her father's map indicated, under a flat rock near the railing. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and dust and time. The single room contained a wood stove, a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame, and shelves lined with canning jars and supplies. Everything coated in years of stillness. But the structure was sound. The roof, despite its appearance, didn't leak. The stove just needed cleaning. And when Patricia walked to the back window and looked out at the view, mountains rolling away in layers of blue and green, something tight in her chest finally loosened. She spent the first week just cleaning, sweeping away cobwebs, scrubbing surfaces, airing out the cabin until it smelled less like abandonment and more like possibility. She bought basic supplies in the nearest town, 20 miles down the mountain, where the grocery clerk asked if she was renting the old Warren place. "No," Patricia said. "I own it." The clerk raised her eyebrows, but didn't ask questions. Slowly, the cabin became livable, then comfortable. Patricia planted a small garden using seeds and knowledge she'd nearly forgotten from her own mother. She repaired the porch railing. She figured out the propane system and the water pump. And every evening, she sat on that porch watching the sun set over mountains that belonged to no one and everyone at once, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. She didn't hear from Raymond. Didn't hear from the children except for occasional, obligatory texts. And gradually, she realized she didn't need to. One afternoon, 2 months after arriving, Patricia walked into town and stopped at the community center. A bulletin board advertised local needs, meals for elderly residents, tutoring for children, community garden volunteers. Patricia took down a number, made a call, and the next week, She started helping deliver meals to homebound neighbors, many of whom were younger than she was, but isolated by circumstance or health. Word spread quietly. People began stopping by the cabin, asking advice about gardens, about canning, about how she'd restored the place so well. Patricia started teaching small workshops. Nothing formal, just neighbors helping neighbors. Her life became smaller in geography, but larger in meaning. Then one morning, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Warren? This is James Chun from Mountain Heritage Trust. I'm calling about your property. Patricia set down her coffee slowly. What about my property? We've been doing land surveys for a conservation project, James Chun explained, his voice professional but warm. Your 40 acres sit right in the middle of a critical wildlife corridor we're trying to protect. I wanted to discuss options. I'm not selling, Patricia said immediately. I understand, but I hoped you might be willing to consider a conservation easement. You'd retain ownership and could live there permanently, but you'd be compensated fairly for agreeing to keep the land undeveloped. The payment would be substantial, enough to ensure your financial security while protecting the ecosystem. Patricia listened as he explained the details, the number he mentioned far exceeding anything Raymond had left her with. But more than that, it meant the land her father bought, the cabin he built, would remain exactly as it was, protected, preserved, purposeful. I'll need to think about it, she said. Of course. I'll email the information. Take your time. After he hung up, Patricia sat on the porch, watching morning light filter through the trees. She thought about her father building this place board by board, about the life she'd lost and the life she'd found, about what security really meant. She called James Chin back that afternoon. I have some conditions. They met the following week. Patricia agreed to the easement, but with stipulations. The cabin and 5 surrounding acres would remain hers to use and eventually pass to her grandchildren. The remaining land would be protected, and part of the annual compensation would fund a small community program she wanted to establish, teaching practical skills to people rebuilding their lives. The contract was signed within a month. The first payment arrived 2 weeks later, more money than Patricia had seen in her entire marriage, money that was entirely, legally, unquestionably hers. She didn't call Raymond to tell him, didn't call the children. She simply deposited the check, set up the trust her lawyer recommended, and went back to her life on the mountain. But word traveled anyway. Small towns talk. 3 months later, Raymond's number appeared on her phone. Patricia stared at it for a long moment, then answered. I heard about your property deal, he said, skipping any greeting. That's community property from during our marriage. My lawyer says I'm entitled to half. Patricia smiled, something she wouldn't have been able to do 6 months earlier. Your lawyer is wrong. I inherited that land from my father in 1985. It was deeded solely to me, never marital property. But you're welcome to waste money trying. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. You never mentioned. You never asked, Patricia said quietly. 45 years, Raymond, and you never once asked what I might need, or have, or want. You assumed I was nothing without you. Patricia, I hope you and Melissa are happy. I really do. But I'm happier now than I've been in decades, and I did that myself, with something you never knew existed because you never cared to know. Goodbye, Raymond. She hung up before he could respond. That evening, Patricia taught a canning workshop to 6 women from town, ranging from age 19 to 67, all of them rebuilding something: finances, confidence, lives interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. They laughed together, made mistakes together, and shared a meal afterward on the cabin porch as the sun set over protected mountains. Patricia looked around at these near strangers who had become something like family, at the home she had built from almost nothing, at the life that finally belonged entirely to herself. Her father had been right. Shelter was where everything began. But she had learned something he hadn't written in that letter. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought mattered to discover what actually does. The cabin stood solid behind her, lights glowing warm against the darkening sky. Tomorrow she'd work in the garden. Next week, another workshop. Next month, her first grandchild would visit, and Patricia would show her the land that had saved them both. She had been replaced, discarded, left with nothing. And from that nothing, she had built everything that mattered. Not because someone gave it to her, not because she'd married it or inherited status or played by rules designed for someone else's benefit, but because a father had believed his daughter deserved something no one could take, and a woman had finally learned she was strong enough to claim it.